You're listening to the Compassion Fatigue podcast with your host, Jennifer Blau. This is session 39. My guest today is Hilary Hager, who has spent the last 17 years managing volunteers in animal welfare environments and currently serves as the Senior Director of Volunteer Engagement at the Humane Society of the United States. Engaging volunteers in meaningful work to make the world a more humane place is Hilary's passion and life's work. She teaches compassion fatigue workshops around the country to help provide members of the animal protection community the support and resources to maintain their own well-being while working in a challenging and emotionally charged environment. In addition to managing volunteers in shelters, Hilary has been a volunteer herself at a wildlife rehabilitation center in Washington State and has served on the board of directors for a chimpanzee sanctuary, the Washington State Federation of Animal Care and Control Agencies, and a Friends of nonprofit group supporting the work of a municipality-operated shelter. Hilary holds a master's degree in nonprofit leadership from Seattle University. Here today to talk all about crisis response with animal rescue, please welcome Hilary Hager. Hi, Hilary. Welcome to the Compassion Fatigue podcast. How are you?
I'm great. Thank you. I appreciate you having me.
Well, I really appreciate you taking out this time. I know that the HSUS has been so busy here in recent months, with the hurricanes and all these natural disasters that we're experiencing right now. I think this is going to be such a timely topic for our listeners. So before you tell us about the animal response team, can you tell us a little bit about your own personal background in animal welfare?
Yeah, of course. So I currently work at the Humane Society of the United States as the Senior Director of Volunteer Engagement. I came here in 2011, and as your listeners probably are aware, we're not the parent company of local humane societies, and we work really to sort of fight cruelty at its root causes. However, we do have, a pretty robust volunteer program, about 3,000 people across the country who are working in our animal rescue team or who are doing grassroots organizing. We have care centers, primarily wildlife rehabilitation or large animal sanctuaries in Oregon, California, Texas, and Florida. So, the good news for me is that I'm not responsible for managing all of those volunteers, but instead am responsible for sort of creating the process and the structure for engaging volunteers in that work. And then also to kind of partner with all of these different departments to make sure that they're sort of engaging in best practices as they involve volunteers in their work. So I started that in 2011, but before that I worked for about 12 years in 2 different shelters here in Washington State where I live. So the first shelter was a limited intake nonprofit shelter that took in about 4,000 animals a year and had a pretty high live release rate and a really robust volunteer program, which I managed in addition to overseeing the dog training program, our behavior helpline, and managed also a cats-only adoption center in Seattle. And I was there for about 6.5 years, and then I left and got my nonprofit leadership master's degree from Seattle University, and then went to go work for a municipal shelter here in the town where I was living. That at that time was taking in about 9,000 animals a year with a lower live release rate and also breed-specific legislation, side note. And there I managed the volunteer program, the transfer program, the outreach and education programs, and then also our transfer program, and then was one of 2 managers who sort of stepped in to help wherever was needed around the organization. So in addition to that, I also am a volunteer myself. I serve as the president of the Washington State Federation of Animal Care and Control Agencies. I spent about 3 years doing wildlife rehabilitation volunteer work, which I loved, and also served on the board of directors for a chimpanzee sanctuary here in Washington State. So I'm like probably many of your listeners, I have a hard time saying no. I like to have my fingers involved in a lot of different things.
So Hilary, speaking of volunteers, can you tell us more about the HSUS Animal Response Team and your role with that?
Yeah, sure. So, our animal response team works primarily with law enforcement to investigate illegal animal cruelty, really working to target the worst cases of abuse across the country. So we partner with local organizations who maybe don't have the capacity to address these cases on their own. And every year we rescue thousands of animals from puppy mills, animal fighting operations, and other situations where animals are suffering really life-threatening cruelty and neglect. In addition to that, we provide expert animal rescue response to natural disasters, which is what we've really been hearing about a lot recently. So mainly volunteers are involved if and when we are in the position of needing to set up a temporary shelter to house animals after they've been rescued. We don't typically deploy volunteers in the field. I know often there's a high level of technical response that's required and a lot of vetting, especially in a disaster situation. And so primarily our volunteers come in to help us get the shelter set up and then to provide animal care while the animals are in our care before they can sort of be dispositioned, right? Once they're free and clear of the case, when we can transfer them out to our emergency placement partners, where the animals can then be processed and made available for adoption.
Okay, and so you mentioned that we've had so many hurricanes here recently. Are there other type of like natural disasters that the animal response team will be deployed to?
Yeah, well, it really is dependent on mutual or on memorandum of understandings that we establish with organizations and with municipalities when we get called in. So, obviously hurricanes are in the news lately, but we have also responded after other types of storms or in tornadoes. Like we helped manage a huge shelter in Joplin. More recently, what we have been doing in the model that we have sort of taken is to, instead of assisting with temporary shelters in the immediate aftermath of the storm, we worked really hard to empty the shelters in those affected areas of the animals that they already had in their care who were awaiting adoption, so that those organizations themselves had the increased capacity to care for animals that may be coming in from the local area, from the people who have been affected by the storm. So in other words, there were animals hanging out in shelters already. We helped transport those areas out of the affected area to our emergency placement partners in other parts of the country. And so that's an interesting and different model. Of course, we're not able to do that with tornadoes or earthquakes or things that you can't predict. But with these storms that we see coming, we're able to move the animals out, and it's made a huge difference.
And so, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's my understanding that Hurricane Katrina was really kind of crucial, like a turning point in this, because the human first responders started to realize that people were not leaving. They would refuse to leave without their animals. And did you find that Hurricane Katrina was really kind of a turning point in how crisis response is handled, at least on the non-human level?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think everyone sort of points to that as a watershed moment where really that was the thing, is that people didn't, a lot of people just couldn't leave, but many people chose not to leave because they didn't have the option of bringing their animals with them, and pets are family, right? So people wound up being in really vulnerable positions because they were trying to care for their animals. And so in that situation, when the animals were left behind and the people were evacuated, it caused its own sort of secondary disaster that the humane community responded to, which is why they had to set up a huge shelter at Lamar Dixon and to sort of house all these animals, many of whom never wound up finding their people, potentially because they were already strays on the street, so they weren't owned before the storm, but they were just sort of hanging out in this shelter for weeks and weeks and weeks as we were trying to sort it out. So that prompted a change in policy that really encourages people to take animals with them, and for animals to be rescued with humans, by the National Guard in these kinds of situations. And so the message continues to be to encourage people to have a plan for their pets and to make a plan for evacuating with them. And it really has made a huge difference.
Wow. And so, I imagine that so first of all, animal rescue is difficult in and of itself, right? What is the hardest part when you throw the immediacy and the intensity into situations with animal rescue? What would you say is the hardest part of crisis response?
Yeah, well, the guiding principle of crisis response is using an incident command structure, right? It's really clear. Everybody knows who is responsible for what and which element of the response, and everybody knows who to go to and contact as needed. And I think, honestly, one of the hardest parts about this is there are so many well-meaning people who are desperate to get help and to get involved. And while that's really appreciated, what happens is a lot of times is that really unintentionally makes things harder. As everyone's coming to help, everyone wants to offer resources. But the thing is they have to really be coordinated, and all of the resources need to be allocated appropriately. And so what happens is that really there are people who are self-deploying, and that really can make things go awry. So, all of us like to have a plan. We like to know exactly what to expect. And this involves a lot of the unexpected. And so then there are people who sort of take it upon themselves to load up and to bring supplies themselves, and it winds up complicating things in unexpected ways. I mean, certainly unexpected from the perspective of the person who's trying to help, very, very expected from the people who are realizing that they don't really know what's going on anymore because, the person who was really well intended and wanted to deliver hay into the affected area and have brought hay, but now the people who are, otherwise responsible for delivering hay don't realize where the hay is gone. They're showing up and trying to deliver hay. It's a duplication of effort. And, the other thing that happens is a lot of times is that people who wind up self-deploying wind up needing help themselves. They get into difficult situations, particularly when it's unsafe or dangerous. And then that can potentially, it redirects the responders into having to provide care for other people, not just the victims of the storm, right? And so that seems to be one of the more challenging parts is helping everybody to understand that this incident command structure exists, and it's not just about bureaucracy or trying to make things difficult. It's about, there's really a method to the madness, and that helps to really make sure everybody's covering all of the pieces of the puzzle. And then when there are these variables coming in from the outside, it's very complicating.
And this critical incident command system, this is not just something that you use with animal rescue. FEMA uses it. Any type of first responder, they all abide by this system as well. So
that's right. And it's actually a required training for volunteers who participate in our programs. There are a series of 3 different courses that are offered by FEMA, the ICS 100, or there's 3, IS 100, 200, and 700 are the courses. But that is it's the bedrock of the work that we do. And even if we are not partnering with other organizations and it's just a single agency response, it's just HSUS responding to something, we create our own ICS internally so that we're clear about who's responsible for what piece of this project. But then, of course, if it's an interagency response and we are partnered with government agencies, it's just essential. And so I think sometimes people have this idea that everybody just likes to make things more complicated, especially when working with government. There's this idea that, there's bureaucracy and people just want to make things more complicated just because. But the thing is that it really does make a difference. And so it makes it a lot harder when people sort of try to insert themselves into that without following the structure, for sure.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So, the most, well, at least at the time that this podcast goes live, we're really dealing with an incident of a hurricane in Puerto Rico. What has been especially difficult about that situation?
Yeah, well, the main issue is that the infrastructure around animal care and animal issues in Puerto Rico was already really lacking before the storm. So having it be hit as badly as it has been by the storm is certainly not helping. There's an estimated population of around 400,000 roaming dogs and about 1 million roaming cats on the island. So this really has just exacerbated all the issues that were already in existence. And so, in addition to that, now, of course, people who have had pets whose pets were not counted among those 400,000 dogs and 1 million cats now are in situations themselves where they are not able to provide care because there's such a humanitarian crisis going on. So, what we're seeing is that the level of devastation on the island is really just compounding the challenge of all kinds of response for everyone, right? Communication channels are down. Reporting channels are non-existent. Transport routes are completely destroyed. And then also, to be frank, there appears to be a lack of some cultural sensitivity on the part of federal agencies who are responding, right? They are coming from off the island. They're not familiar with the lay of the land and sort of the way things work in Puerto Rico. And it's really making it a lot more challenging. And there's a level of bureaucracy that everyone's having to negotiate that really is presenting a lot of challenges for everyone.
Yeah, you bring up such an interesting point. I think a lot of times we think of this, crisis responses. You're going and rescuing people from rooftops, or not people, but you're helping people who would otherwise be, this would be me, right, sitting on my rooftop with my, hordes of animals, refusing to go to the shelter because I'm not leaving my family behind. But I think we don't think about all the animals that don't even have homes, right? That don't even have owners. Right. So that's got to add an entire huge layer of complexity to these rescue situations.
Yeah. It's very interesting hearing our colleagues with Humane Society International talk about the way that they respond to disasters abroad where there are large street dog populations. It's not like It's not like you would round all those animals up and put them in shelters because they weren't owned pets before. They don't have people who are coming for them. There's no place that those animals are going to go. There aren't any homes available for them. And so in a way, it would be like collecting wildlife after a disaster. And so, and which nobody does, right? And so, it's really trying to make sure that the animals, if they have obvious injuries, are being seen by veterinarians, and making sure that the support structures that were in place for those animals before, whether they were people who were, there are lots of feeding stations in Puerto Rico. There are people who cook up big batches of food and then go on their routes and put food out twice a day for hundreds of animals at a time. And so, those resources are not there anymore. And so we're looking at how we can bolster that. And we have teams on the ground trying to do that. We also have had a project in Vieques on the island with a horse immunocontraception program. There's a huge population of roaming horses there on the island. And we've been working to sterilize those horses, sort of stabilize the population. And we've had a team on the ground checking in on those horses and making sure that the folks there are having access. It's a very small island, and it's been very hard to get to. So there's a lot going on in Puerto Rico.
And this just really kind of emphasizes the need for that, critical incident command structure, right? And
right.
I mean, this just seems so overwhelming, right? So as far as, trauma and compassion fatigue and burnout, how do you think crisis response differs from, quote unquote, if there is such a thing, typical animal rescue work?
Yeah. Well, I think that, I what I didn't mention in my intro is that one of the other things that I do is teach compassion fatigue workshops myself, right? And so I always think about how, I'm talking to my peers and your peers in the animal rescue community and about how to practice self-care, being able to unplug and recognizing that there's only so much one person can do, and trying to find work-life balance, and all of that is great. But in the face of immediate crisis, I think it's a much bigger challenge. And so there's no turning off, right? But I think mainly one of the things that there are a couple kind of two elements of this response that maybe make it even more challenging. I think the first is that, our responders are having contact with people who are really in crisis themselves, right? So it's not just about their interaction with animals, and animals who are in a bad situation. They're really exposed to the trauma of people whose needs aren't being met, who have really severely limited resources and limited access to assistance. And so they are really in a tough spot. And so our people who are very compassionate and who, are doing this work because of their compassion for animals, and including human animals, really get exposed to that in a different way. And for those people on the ground, it's not just about surviving the storm, although that itself can present challenges, right? But it's also about surviving afterward. There are changes in their family structure. There's changes in the transportation system and the economy that'll have a really long-lasting impact for these humans. And our responders are right there with these folks and their animals, and it's really close up and very affecting for them. I think the other issue is that, we wind up coming into contact with people who really already couldn't afford to care for their pets, and we're seeing kind of the impact of that, right? So there might be animals who maybe weren't kept in a manner that we might be accustomed to seeing, or maybe even be comfortable with. And responders really have to put that aside, right? So it's not a time for passing judgment, and it's just a time really to focus on helping. And, and most certainly there's an opportunity to provide some education. The focus in a crisis isn't about fixing everything and fixing all of the ills, which is challenging because a lot of us are fixers, but it's really about triaging and seeing what needs to be done right then to help the animals.
Yeah. So it's almost like, I don't know if you've heard this definition of, animal control versus shelter work, but it sounds like this is a time not to be wearing the boots, but to be wearing the Birkenstocks.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And, and for these folks, our responders who are on the team, in really challenging conditions, right? I mean, so not only, when I think about the work that I have done in sheltering, and even on the hardest days, right? Like I had a place, I had like a hotel room at the worst case scenario. I had a hotel room that I could crash in at the end of the night or crash in my house. But, in Puerto Rico right now, I mean, there is really not any drinking water. There's very little drinking water. There's hardly any electricity. So the conditions are really, really challenging. So there's no place to sort of take a break. And even when, in the shelter, sometimes there is a place to take a break, but we don't allow ourselves to. In this case, there really isn't any place where you can just sort of unplug, even for just 10 minutes, to sort of catch your breath and reflect before you go back out there. And I think that really does compound the issue for our responders.
And so, given the urgency and intensity of crisis response, what advice would you have for managing compassion fatigue? I mean, like you said, you can't just like say, "Oh, I'm just going to go, take an hour yoga class today in the middle of this
Right.
crisis," right? Or I'm going to take a run, or
Yeah.
I'm going to go meditate for 10 minutes. So, is it really about at that point? Just making sure that you've been taking care of yourself all along so that you've built up this resiliency so you can like jump into action when it's needed? Or is it about trying to take those little self-care breaks? What is your best advice?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of both, right? I mean, certainly the thing to do is to sort of master those self-soothing techniques when the stakes are low, so that when the stakes are high and the intensity is really high, those things are accessible, right? So I think that there is something to be said for, being able to calm yourself, whether it's with breathing or softening your pelvic floor or whatever it is, whatever practice it is that somebody has to really be good at it so that they can call upon it when it's really needed. But I think the other piece of it is that, recognizing that since there is no opportunity to really unplug, I mean, sometimes what you just have to do is really focus on the small things. I talked to Shada Varsha, who is our senior director of this response, and she's sort of our incident commander for all of these, this litany of issues that we've been experiencing with Harvey and with Irma and now Maria. And I asked her this question because I wanted to know what she was doing, because she's been on 24/7 since, and it's, at this point of the recording, it's, like 50 something days in. And what she was telling me is that really, it's almost impossible given the intensity of the need and the volume here to really take those deep breaths and to reflect and to lower stress. So for her, it's really about remembering to do things like having enough water, or even like going to the bathroom when you need to instead of waiting hours and hours. I've certainly been guilty of that myself. I like 8 hours later, I'm like, God, I have to go to the bathroom for days, it seems like, so remembering to do those things, or even sometimes, like having a reminder to do those things is really important. But what Shada told me is that her strategy really is around remaining systematic and creating a process and sticking to it. And really remembering that the goal doesn't need to be set for like the week or the month, but really focusing on what has to get done that day. Like just that day, that's it. And remembering that any work that you do is good work and that it's life-changing. And so, our inclination, I think, sometimes is to try to count our victories by the thousands and the millions, but instead to really be focused on the wins by like the single or the dozen. So it doesn't really matter the scale. And instead of thinking really broadly and thinking, oh, geez, I have to help as many as possible. If a lot of people are helping just a few animals at a time, like we're all working on it together, the numbers add up and we get there. And that's really been her strategy for coping, because otherwise the problem just seems too overwhelming.
And sometimes when things become that overwhelming, we almost become paralyzed and then we do nothing.
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep,
So what can
absolutely.
people, whether they're part of a response team or not, what can people do to help to prepare their own animals, whether they're animals that they're companion animals or they're animals that they work with? What can they do to prepare in the event of any type of natural disaster or other crisis?
Yeah, well, that's a really great and important question. I mean, I think certainly organizations should have a plan in place. Like, what are we going to do if things go south? Like in Northern California right now with the wildfires, I mean, shelters are evacuating. And so, those groups have had to have a plan ahead of time, like a mutual aid agreement with other organizations about being able to move animals out as needed. So certainly, individual organizations should make a plan, and everyone on the team should know what the plan is and be able to put that into place. And recognize that it may be even more challenging if your staff are in the middle of dealing with their own personal response. Like if their home is at risk or their home has been damaged, it may be very difficult for them to be present for the animals. But I think there are some really key steps that pet owners themselves can take ahead of a disaster. And I mean, there's a whole list of them, right? I mean, they need to make sure that their dogs and cats are wearing ID and or are microchipped. Tags really are better because not everybody has a chip reader to get the information off of a microchip. Everybody should put together a disaster kit and include the information that they need about their animals in their kit to make sure they have good photos of their animals so that they can sort of prove ownership if they need to. And it's also important to try to identify a safe place to stay ahead of time. And, it's important to remember there's no guarantee you'll be able to take your pet with you to a shelter. The Red Cross, for example, isn't required to allow people to have their pets in a shelter, and they may or may not be able to set up either a pet-friendly shelter or to have co-sheltering when there's an animal shelter sort of adjacent to a human shelter. So you want to think about where there's pet-friendly lodging, or to make arrangements with friends or relatives who are out of the area. And also, of course, if you evacuate, you really want to take your pet with you. If you decide not to evacuate, you want to follow steps to make sure that you're doing it as safely as possible. And, especially in Texas, in Florida too, we were really struck by how many animals beyond dogs and cats were impacted, right? And people really need to have a plan for their livestock and their horses. So horses can be microchipped, or you can sort of braid their manes and sort of attach tags in their hair, or spray paint phone numbers on the animals themselves if you have time. But one thing that's really important is to practice trailering your animals before disaster strikes, so that they're easy to get on and off of a rig and able to get out. And if you have pets or animals that really can't be trailered or moved, where there really isn't any time, it's important to know that the best strategy is really to set the animals loose, to break fences, and to let the animals run free and give them a chance to run for it, rather than leaving them in a pasture or in a barn. You have to make sure to cut off access so that the animals don't run back into the barn or the pasture after they've been set free. But they really have a better chance of surviving if they're able to flee than if they're trapped in a stall or a paddock they can't escape.
And I think this is so important for everyone listening because, you might not be in a hurricane or tornado prone area, but this could be on a smaller scale. You could have a house fire, right?
Mm-hmm,
Things that you need to be ready to, be prepared for.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, we had a gas leak in my old neighborhood, and there was I was in the middle. It was when we had two dogs and 4 cats, and I was trying to think of how, I thought, God, I don't even know if I have individual carriers for all of my cats. And if I do, I'm not sure all 4 can fit in my car at once. And then my neighbor across the street called and asked if I could help with her 2 dogs and her 3 birds. And I was trying to picture how they were all going to fit in my Outback. And I was game to try, but I think it would have been a little bit of a problem. So, thinking about those things ahead of time and having conversations with neighbors to try to make a plan. And, I'm hearing heartbreaking stories now about California, with all these houses that have caught fire. In some cases it was the middle of the day. And so there were people who were at work, so they weren't even home. And the fires came on so quickly that animals who were at home hanging out like they do every day wound up perishing in the fire because there was nobody there to help them. And it's just heartbreaking to think about. I almost can't think about it.
Yeah. So what advice would you give to maybe some other organizations? So you mentioned, there's shelters in California that are dealing with this right now. What type of advice would you give to these organizations that also deal with these types of crisis situations? So in addition to having that plan, what would you recommend kind of after the fact? So, maybe debriefing or helping their staff kind of heal from this.
Yeah. Yeah, well, I think communication is really essential, and I know that, some folks are talkers and like to talk and process things out loud, and other people really aren't. But I think the most important thing is to make sure that your team knows that help is available if they need it. So, if you have access to EAP programs, employee assistance programs, make sure to offer those to the team and to try to connect people to the resources that are there and available. But also really just to check in, whether you're doing it as a team, as a group, or whether you're kind of connecting with people individually. I think it's also really nice to think about having a phone tree. So it's not just one person responsible for calling everyone on the team, but rather to kind of break it up so that everybody's checking in. And at HSCOS, we have a 3-day rule, right? So people kind of get demobilized, they get home, and then somebody checks in with them 3 days later, like, hey, how are you doing? How is it going? So this gives people some space, but really helps them to know that they've got support if they need it. And I think it's, everybody just needs to understand that, you do what you need to do to get through it. And sometimes you don't even notice as you're doing it just how hard it is. And it's not until you kind of sit down and relax a little bit and the cortisol wears off that you really start to be impacted by it. So remembering that it's not just when you're there and it's hard and it's dirty and it's a challenge, it's a little bit later that things can sort of really start to hit folks. And so you want to be able to not just have the conversation once, but continue to check in with people over time.
That makes a lot of sense. So, as challenging as crisis response work is, what do you think is the most rewarding part of it?
I think it's about bringing hope in what feels like a really hopeless space, right? And filling a human basic need. We're helping people to understand that they're important and that they're seen and that they're cared about. A lot of people really rely on their pets for love and support. They're members of the family, right? I'm sure you feel the same way about yours as I do about mine. And so the burden that people experience when they feel like their animals aren't safe and they don't know what's going on with them can really be crippling. And so even in the face of all of these things that are going on and all of the loss that people experience, the fact that they can have their pet with them and to know that their loved pets are safe it's huge. And so it really helps to support people's well-being. And we're so grateful to have that opportunity to be able to do that. And of course, we love the animals, but we recognize that helping animals is helping people too. And that really matters.
And so, Hilary, what can people do to help your efforts or maybe even get involved?
Yeah, well, I mean, all of these weeks of responding to all of these hurricanes and, not to mention the earthquake in Mexico, we have an international affiliate that has been responding there. All of that represents a heavy financial cost. So, of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't mention that people can donate to our disaster relief fund at humanesociety.org. But I also could tell you that, we're always looking for volunteers who we can sort of pre-screen and get vetted ahead of time so that we're able to deploy to these situations as needed. In this case, with the hurricanes, we didn't set up temporary shelters, so we weren't deploying people into the storm zone. But we have had volunteers who have been meeting these planes as we're loading animals and sending them off to different parts of the country. And in all of these other temporary shelters that we wind up setting in these other cases, we of course have to have volunteers help with. So our volunteers have to take those FEMA courses that I mentioned earlier, the IS 100, 200, and 700. They need to provide a proof of tetanus vaccine and also pass a background check. And anyone can go to humanesociety.org/volunteer to look that up. But, it's also a really great idea to get involved in your local animal response teams, right? They're either called DARTs, Disaster Animal Rescue Teams, or CARTs, which is Companion Animal Response Teams. So, getting connected and working in your own community, connecting with the resources that are there are really important. We get called in when local capacity is overwhelmed. So, which is great, but also, when having people really connecting with their own local community so that they can help bolster the resources that are there is really important. And also, you wind up connecting with a lot of really great people who share your interests and values, and it's just a great way to be involved in your community. So, of course, it's nice if people want to get involved with the Humane Society of the United States, but really what's most important is that people just simply get involved wherever it makes sense for them.
And so, Hilary, great advice. Just one last question for you. What do you personally do to manage your own compassion fatigue? What are some of your favorite ways?
Oh, that's a great question. So I started running. And so I run, and that's one of my main means of managing stress. And I also took up playing ice hockey. I'm over 40, so it doesn't always feel like it's self-care, and I wind up feeling a little bit slower afterwards. But you wear pads and you wear a helmet. So I find that I have to move. And also, it's really important to me to connect with other people. And so I'll be honest, when I teach these compassion fatigue workshops, I always say, I teach the thing I need to learn the most. And so every time I do a workshop, it's me reminding myself of the things that I need to do. And connecting with people in that way really feels like it's an important part of me sort of managing. It's the thing I can do, right? Like I manage my own stress by helping other people learn how to manage theirs, kind of thing.
I totally agree with you. I also give compassion fatigue workshops, and I feel that not only every time I give the workshop is it reminding me, hey, you got to take care of yourself too, right? But there is something very healing about being able to help those people who are helping animals.
Yeah. Yeah. And, the other thing is that I love my job and I work from home. And as much as I love spending time with my dogs and cats, it is very nice. Shelter people are my people. And so I really love getting to be with them, and when I took this job at HSUS, I worried a little bit that I would really miss it. So much of my identity was wrapped up in being a shelter person that I didn't know what it would be like to not work in a shelter anymore. And I'm pleased to say, it's funny, I still am involved with my old shelter. I have a volunteer there and I help out when I can. And every time I go, I think, well, maybe is it time for me to go work in the shelter again? And then I go and I think, nope, it's good. I'm glad to be able to check in and be supportive of the team. and then leave. But I love being with shelter people. It's where it's my tribe. So getting, I really love being able to spend time helping people think about how they can stick around for the long haul. Because we need as many people and as many hands on deck as we can, and we need people not to be suffering while they're doing it, right? So
yeah, that's the whole point of this show really is, I think that, the more people that I can help and by having experts like you come on the show, the more people that we can help to stay strong and resilient, the more soldiers we have in this army, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, Hilary, thank you so much for taking the time out. Thank you for all the work that you and the HSUS does for animals. I really appreciate the time today.
Yeah, anytime. So glad to be here. Thanks a bunch.
All right, take care. Thank you so much for listening to the Compassion Fatigue podcast. Please remember to share this show with all your friends and colleagues who you think might benefit from this important information. And don't forget to check out the CompassionFatiguePodcast.com for more great resources, including a link to join our private Facebook group where you can connect with other listeners. Please note that this podcast is not meant to provide medical advice or substitute for psychological care. Please consult with a mental health professional if you need additional support. And if you are feeling suicidal, please go to your nearest emergency room or call 911.